Let me tell you a story, one that our village still whispers about to this day. It's a tale of greed, blood, and a curse that stretched across generations. It happened many years ago in the village of Mafa, where three brothers destroyed their bond over their father's inheritance. You see, their father, Baba Mafa, was a wealthy man by village standards. He owned vast fields, cattle that stretched as far as the eye could see, and a homestead that housed generations of family. But his death would prove to be the seed of destruction. Baba Mafa's three sons were left to inherit all he had worked for. Sabelo, the eldest, was supposed to lead as tradition dictated, but the other two, Jonah and Ayanda, had their own thoughts. Jonah was sharp-tongued, jealous, always watching his older brother with bitterness. Ayanda, the youngest, was quiet, but no fool. He had dreams of owning it all. In a quiet village surrounded by vast stretches of land, a funeral was held at Baba Mafa's homestead. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dusty courtyard. Women sat on reed mats near the kitchen hut, wailing loudly, their cries carried by the wind. Men gathered on the other side, speaking in hushed tones with their heads bowed. Smoke rose from a small fire where elders made tea. Three young men stood apart: Sabelo, the eldest, Jonah, the middle son, and Ayanda, the youngest. Their faces told a silent story: grief, resentment, and unspoken words. Sabelo, calm and weary, spoke first. "We should sit with the elders, show them we are united. It is what Baba would have wanted." Jonah, mocking with a smirk, replied, "United? Sabelo, you speak as if you don't know what is coming. Unity is for fools who accept being trampled. Some of us still have spines." Sabelo turned to face Jonah, his tone stern. "Do not start, Jonah. This is not the time. Baba has not been gone a full day, and already you speak poison." Jonah snapped back, his voice low but sharp. "Poison! You are the one sitting high, Sabelo, like you already wear Baba's crown. What did he whisper to you before he died? That you are the chosen one? That you deserve it all because you are firstborn?" Sabelo gritted his teeth, controlling his anger. "Tradition decides that, Jonah. Not me. You know this." Ayanda, quiet and hesitant, tried to calm them. "Brothers, please, not here. The whole village is watching us. Let us bury Baba in peace." Ayanda's face was pale and worried. He looked younger than his years, caught between the tension of his older brothers. In the background, the women's cries grew louder, rising and falling like waves. An elder passed by and glanced at the three brothers, shaking his head slightly. Jonah, ignoring Ayanda, stepped closer to Sabelo, his voice dripping with bitterness. "Tradition, tradition. That word comes so easily to your mouth. You love tradition because it benefits you, doesn't it? You stand to inherit Baba's land, his cattle, his name. And what do Ayanda and I get? Scraps? A few goats and dry fields? We are sons, too." Sabelo, coolly and without breaking eye contact, said, "You would dishonor Baba by fighting over his possessions before he is even in the ground? Shame on you, Jonah. Shame on you." Jonah laughed darkly, his voice rising. "Dishonor? Let me tell you something, Sabelo. A man can only be patient for so long before he takes what he deserves." Ayanda, urgently stepping between them, his voice trembling, said, "Stop this! Jonah, Sabelo, stop! People are looking. Baba's spirit is watching us." The villagers glanced toward the brothers. Some elders frowned and shook their heads in disappointment, muttering among themselves. A woman near the fire sighed heavily and said to another, "This is how families tear themselves apart. Baba Mafa is not even cold in the grave." The second woman nodded in agreement. "And the middle one, Jonah? He has always had a fire in him. That fire will burn the whole homestead if they are not careful." Sabelo turned and began to walk away toward the elders, his posture straight and composed. Jonah stayed behind, fuming, fists clenched at his sides. Ayanda lingered awkwardly, torn between following Sabelo and comforting Jonah. Ayanda, softly to Jonah, said, "Jonah, this is not the way. Sabelo is not our enemy. We are brothers." Jonah cut him off, his voice low and icy. "Open your eyes, Ayanda. Sabelo would see us both beggars if it meant he could sit on Baba's throne alone. If you can't see that, you're a fool." Ayanda hesitated. "But—" Jonah grabbed Ayanda's shoulder and looked him in the eyes. "Listen to me. Things are going to change. I promise you that. Sabelo's day will come, and when it does, he will wish he treated us as equals." Jonah released Ayanda and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Ayanda stood alone for a moment, looking unsure, his eyes flicking between the elders gathered in one corner and his brother's retreating figure. The wailing of the women echoed louder, as though the land itself mourned more than just Baba Mafa's passing. That was the moment it began. A few angry words, a glance too sharp, and a seed of bitterness planted in the soil of a grieving home. What Jonah and Ayanda did not realize was that envy, like fire, starts small, but left unchecked, it will consume everything in its path, leaving only ashes behind. Once, in the homestead's main hut, the reading of Baba Mafa's will took place. The air inside was heavy with expectation. A large wooden table sat at the center of the room, with elders seated on either side, their faces lined with wisdom and authority. A thick envelope, its edges worn, rested in front of the village elder, Sekuru Juru, a man whose deep voice carried a quiet, commanding power. The room was dimly lit, with only shafts of light spilling through the small windows, catching dust that danced in the still air. The brothers sat together, but apart. Sabelo, the eldest, sat closest to the elder, his back straight, hands clasped in his lap. Jonah slouched in his seat, arms folded tightly across his chest, a permanent scowl on his face. Ayanda, the youngest, shifted nervously, his foot tapping against the clay floor, eyes darting between his brothers and the elder. Sekuru Juru cleared his throat, his voice slow and deliberate. "We are gathered here today to honor the final wishes of our late brother, Baba Mafa. May his spirit find peace among the ancestors. This is no small matter, and so I ask for silence and respect." The room stilled. Outside, the faint cries of mourners drifted in, distant but haunting. Jonah exhaled sharply, a barely audible scoff. Sabelo shot him a warning glance, but said nothing. Ayanda lowered his head, avoiding their eyes. Sekuru Juru opened the will, the paper crackling. "Baba Mafa has made his wishes known. Listen carefully, for this is law." Sekuru paused for emphasis, his gaze sweeping over the room, lingering briefly on the three brothers before beginning to read. "To my firstborn son, Sabelo Mafa, I leave the central homestead, the house, the grain storage, and the land that stretches eastward. He shall be the head of this family, the keeper of our name, and the guardian of our traditions." Sabelo nodded solemnly, his expression calm, though his eyes glistened with emotion. He bowed his head respectfully. Across from him, Jonah's jaw tightened. Ayanda snuck a nervous glance at Jonah, who began drumming his fingers irritably against his knee. Jonah whispered bitterly to Ayanda, leaning close. "Of course! The golden boy gets it all. Do you see now? Baba's favoritism lives even in death." Ayanda pleaded softly. "Jonah, not now. Sakuru will hear you." "Sakuru." Juru raised his voice slightly, his eyes narrowing. "There will be silence during the reading." Jonah leaned back, eyes rolling in defiance, but he remained quiet. Ayanda exhaled nervously, his gaze dropping to the floor. Sabelo, as though unmoved by the tension, kept his focus on Sakuru. Sakuru Juru continued, "To my second son, Jonah Mafa, I leave the western field and 10 cows. The land is fertile and will reward hard work. The cattle, if cared for well, will grow and multiply." Jonah stiffened, his face darkening. His hands gripped his knees so tightly his knuckles turned white. He did not speak, but his breathing grew heavier. Jonah muttered under his breath, his voice bitter. 10 cows? A patch of land? What am I, a child to be handed crumbs? Sekuru Juru paused briefly to look up, as if he had heard, then continued. "To my youngest son, Ayanda Mafa, I leave the southern plot, which borders the river, and 5 cows. It is smaller, but rich in potential for growth." Ayanda lifted his head slightly, a look of disappointment flickering across his face before he quickly hid it. He forced a weak nod, but his discomfort was clear. Jonah turned toward him sharply. Jonah whispered angrily, "Potential? That's what they call scraps now? Open your eyes, Ayanda. We are being robbed while Sabelo takes everything." Ayanda responded in a low voice, desperate. "Please, Jonah, don't make this worse." Sakuru Juru folded the paper carefully, his voice firm. "And so, it is done. Baba Mafa's wishes are final, and his spirit will watch over all of you. Sabelo, as the eldest, you will uphold the honor of this family. Jonah, Ayanda, you must work hard and support him as brothers. A family divided cannot stand." Sakuru's words were heavy, and the room felt even more tense. Jonah's expression twisted in disgust as he glared at Sabelo, who remained silent, his face unreadable. Jonah's hand clenched into a fist. Jonah, unable to contain himself, spoke with venom. "This is not fair. This is not justice. Baba was wrong." Sekuru Juru's voice boomed with authority. "Jonah, do not speak such words. You dishonor your father and the ancestors." The room fell silent. Jonah rose suddenly from his seat, the wooden chair scraping loudly against the floor. His face was red with anger, his breath sharp and loud. He pointed at Sabelo, his voice rising. "Enjoy your inheritance while you can, Sabelo. You sit there like a king now, but I promise you, this land will not stay yours forever." Sabelo, calmly and steadily, replied, "Jonah, this is not my doing. It is Baba's word. You must accept it, as we all must." Jonah laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Accept it? Never. You will regret this day, Sabelo. Mark my words." Jonah stormed out of the hut, pushing aside the curtain at the door. Ayanda hesitated, looking from Sabelo to Sakuru, before quietly following his brother outside. Sabelo remained seated, staring straight ahead, though his calm demeanor now seemed forced. The elders exchanged uneasy glances. Sakuru Juru sighed heavily, shaking his head. Sakuru spoke softly to Sabelo. "Keep your brothers close, Sabelo. Anger left unchecked becomes like a raging fire. A family that turns on itself can lose everything." Sabelo replied quietly, his voice faint. "I will try, Sakuru. But Jonah has always had a storm in him." Sabelo gazed toward the door where Jonah had left, his expression unreadable. Outside, faint shouting could be heard as Jonah vented his anger. Ayanda's voice could be heard faintly, trying to calm him down. And so the seeds were planted, seeds of anger, jealousy, and resentment. What began as words would soon turn into actions, and the house of Mafa would never be the same again. On a cool moonlit night in the Mafa homestead, a fire crackled in the courtyard. Its glow danced on the tense faces of three brothers, Sabelo, Jonah, and Ayanda. Crickets chirped faintly in the distance, but the atmosphere was heavy with anger and resentment. Jonah, clearly unhappy, leaned forward, his fists clenched tightly, and spoke sharply. "This is not how it should be. Baba may be gone, but I will not sit back and let you rule over us like some self-proclaimed king, Sabelo." Sabelo, calm but firm, responded, "I am not ruling over anyone, Jonah. I am fulfilling the responsibility Baba left for me. You can hate it all you want, but it is not my choice. It is tradition." Jonah's frustration boiled over as he leaned closer, his voice rising. "Tradition? Tradition is just a fancy word you use to justify greed. Why should you get the best of everything while Ayanda and I fight over scraps? Tell me, Sabelo, does tradition also allow one brother to rob the others?" Sabelo's tone hardened as he replied, "Watch your words, Jonah. You speak of robbery, but I am the one who must bear the burden of leadership. Do you think it is easy to carry the weight of an entire family? You don't want responsibility. You want power." Ayanda shifted uncomfortably, glancing between his brothers as the fire crackled louder. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but hesitated, letting the silence linger. Jonah, unable to contain his anger, stood abruptly, his shadow looming over the others. "Power! You think this is about power? No, Sabelo, this is about justice. I slaved alongside Baba in those fields, just as you did. My sweat is in that soil, too. And Ayanda, he may be quiet, but he has worked just as hard. Yet here you sit, preaching tradition, while reaping everything for yourself." Remaining seated, Sabelo's tone turned icy. "You speak as if I demanded this, Jonah. Baba chose me. The elders approved. If you have grievances, take them to the ancestors, not to me." Jonah scoffed, his voice dripping with bitterness. "The ancestors? Don't make me laugh, Sabelo. The ancestors favor the strong, not the weak who hide behind old men and dusty traditions." Finally, Ayanda spoke, his voice soft but firm, cutting through the tension. "Enough, both of you. This fighting will not bring Baba back. It will not change what has been written." Jonah turned to Ayanda, his face twisted with frustration. "Don't sit there and play the peacemaker, Ayanda. You should be angry too. Sabelo sits on a throne while we're left with nothing." Ayanda surprised them both by raising his voice slightly. "Nothing. Baba gave us land, Jonah, cattle. It is not the same as what Sabelo has, but it is something. You think this fire you carry will make things better? It will only burn everything Baba worked for." Jonah stared at Ayanda, momentarily stunned, before letting out a hollow, bitter laugh. Pointing at Ayanda, he accused, "You're a coward, Ayanda. Always were. You hide behind your quiet words, while Sabelo takes what is rightfully ours." Ayanda lowered his gaze, his face weary, as if burdened by being caught between his brothers. Sabelo finally stood, his posture commanding but his voice steady. "Enough, Jonah. If you want to keep fighting, do it alone. I will not waste my breath arguing with someone who refuses to see reason." Jonah stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing tone. "This isn't over, Sabelo. You may have the elders, the land, and the cattle, but don't think for a second that you've won. You'll see. One day, you'll see." With that, Jonah stormed off into the night. Ayanda watched him go, his unease apparent. Sabelo exhaled deeply, running a hand over his face, and turned to Ayanda. His voice softened as he said, "You should go after him, Ayanda. He listens to you more than he does to me." Ayanda hesitated before replying, "He doesn't listen to anyone, Sabelo. Not anymore." The two brothers stood in silence for a moment, the fire crackling between them. Sabelo stared out into the darkness, worry etched into his face, while Ayanda sat back down, gazing into the flames as though searching for answers. And so the fire burned, not just in the courtyard, but in their hearts. Resentment is like a glowing ember. Left unchecked, it can ignite into something uncontrollable, consuming everything in its path. This was only the beginning. It was a cold, moonless night. The village lay still and silent, shrouded in an unsettling calm. Ayanda stood at the edge of the kraal, nervously cradling a small clay pot in his hands. His breathing was shallow, his eyes darting between the shadows of the cattle pens and the faint flicker of torchlight in the distance. The pot felt heavier than it should, as though its contents carried more than just physical weight. Behind him, Jonah loomed, his voice low and sharp as he hissed with urgency. "Go on, Ayanda," Jonah whispered fiercely. "Do it now, before someone sees us." Ayanda turned slightly, his voice trembling. "I don't know, Jonah. This isn't right. Baba wouldn't—" "Baba is gone, Ayanda," Jonah interrupted, his voice hardening. "What's right doesn't matter anymore. Sabelo has left us no choice. You want to be the good son while he takes everything, or do you want to claim what's yours?" Ayanda stared into the darkened kraal, where the cattle shifted restlessly. Their movements stirred faint clouds of dust in the pale light. The clay pot felt alive in his hands, its contents warm and unsettling, almost pulsing with the weight of the forbidden act he was about to commit. "What if it doesn't work, Jonah?" Ayanda asked, hesitantly, his voice barely audible. "What if something worse happens?" Jonah gripped Ayanda's shoulder, his voice dangerously close to a growl. "Don't be a coward. It will work. The Sangoma said it would. Sabelo's fortune will turn to ash, just like this charm. Now go!" Ayanda took a shaky step forward, his sandals crunching softly on the dry earth. The kraal felt alive, the cattle's breaths misted in the cold night air. A faint breeze rustled the thorny fence, making Ayanda freeze mid-step. Jonah moved closer, his shadow swallowing Ayanda's. "Ayanda!" Jonah hissed impatiently. "Do it now, or I'll do it myself." "I don't want this, Jonah," Ayanda whispered, pleading. "What if Sabelo finds out? What if—" Jonah cut him off, his voice icy. "You spend your whole life asking, 'What if?' while Sabelo eats your share of the inheritance and laughs at us from his throne. This is your chance to take back control, Ayanda. Do it." Ayanda hesitated, staring down at the clay pot. The Sangoma's instructions echoed in his mind. Scatter the ash, and misfortune will follow. But beware, it always returns tenfold. He gripped the pot tighter, his palms sweaty against the cool surface. This doesn't feel right," Ayanda said weakly. "Right won't feed you," Jonah snapped, leaning in with venom in his voice. "Right won't build your home. Sabelo took everything from us. Don't let him take your dignity too. Do it." With his chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths, Ayanda closed his eyes. Slowly, he tilted the pot, letting its dark contents slide out in a slow, eerie stream. The ash caught in the breeze, swirling into the kraal and settling like a ghostly shroud over the ground. The cattle grew restless, some stamping their hooves nervously. A low guttural bellow escaped one of the cows, sending a shiver down Ayanda's spine. "I'm sorry, Sabelo," Ayanda whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry." Jonah stepped forward, his face briefly illuminated by the torchlight. A cruel smile played on his lips as he clapped Ayanda on the back, startling him. "See, that wasn't so hard," Jonah said with a smirk. "You've done well, little brother. Now we wait. Sabelo's perfect life will start crumbling soon enough." Ayanda stared at the kraal, his face pale and unreadable. The night felt colder now, heavier. He didn't respond as Jonah turned and strode off into the shadows, his footsteps crunching on the dry ground. Ayanda lingered, his hands trembling as he placed the empty pot on the ground. A strange sound rose from the kraal, a low, mournful groan that seemed almost human. Ayanda's head snapped toward the sound, his heart pounding. "What have I done?" Ayanda muttered to himself, his voice shaking. The wind picked up suddenly, carrying the ash higher into the air. It swirled around Ayanda, making him cough as he stumbled back. For a brief moment, the ash seemed to form a figure, dark and shifting, with hollow eyes. Ayanda froze, his breath caught in his throat. The figure vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving only the sound of restless cattle and the eerie silence of the night. That night, Ayanda crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The ash had been scattered, and the curse set in motion. But in the shadows of the kraal, unseen by the brothers, something ancient and vengeful had stirred. When greed and fear take root, the harvest is always bitter. The soft glow of dawn bathed the Mafa homestead, but the air was tense and heavy. Sabelo stood at the entrance of the kraal, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Before him lay the bodies of two of his prized cows, large beasts that once symbolized his growing wealth and stature. Now they were lifeless, their stiffened forms sprawled on the dusty ground. Foam streaked their mouths, staining the earth around them. The air carried a faint, sour smell of decay, unusual for animals that had been alive just hours before. A low murmur rippled through the gathering villagers. Men and women in colorful wraps and tattered work clothes clustered just outside the kraal, their faces marked by concern and suspicion. Among them stood the village elders, their stooped figures lending an air of quiet authority. They stroked their beards or pressed walking sticks into the ground as they deliberated. Elder Niika spoke gravely, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "This is not natural. These animals were strong, healthy beasts. Such a sudden death. It is a bad omen." Sabelo knelt by one of the cows, his voice tight with frustration. "I don't understand. They were grazing just yesterday, strong as ever. Now this?" Elder Nola narrowed her eyes as she examined the foam on the cows' mouths. "Poison. This is not sickness. It is sabotage. Someone wanted to harm you, Sabelo." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Women whispered furiously to one another, their voices a mix of fear and intrigue. Sabelo looked up sharply, his face a mask of shock and anger. Ayanda and Jonah lingered at the back of the group, their faces unreadable. Ayanda kept his eyes on the ground, while Jonah's expression flickered between feigned concern and something darker. Sabelo's voice rose, filled with anger. "Who would do this? I have no enemies here. These cows were my pride. They were my future." Elder Naika leaned heavily on his staff. Jealousy makes enemies where there are none, Sabelo. Not all who smile in daylight wish you well in the dark. Sabelo glanced around, his gaze landing briefly on Jonah and Ayanda. If anyone here knows something, now is the time to speak. This is not just an attack on me, it is an attack on our family's name. Jonah stepped forward slightly. His tone was smooth and measured, but his eyes gleamed with cunning. Brother, we all share in your pain. These were Baba's cattle too, a symbol of his hard work. Whoever did this is a coward hiding in the shadows. Ayanda shifted uncomfortably beside him, his hands fidgeting as if trying to dispel the guilt rising within him. Sabelo's sharp eyes caught Ayanda's movements, but he said nothing. Elder Nola pointed to the ground near the kraal, her voice cutting through the tension. Look there, the footprints. They are fresh. Someone was here last night. The villagers pressed closer, craning their necks to see. The elders examined the faint impressions in the dirt, shapes of bare feet, too small to belong to Sabelo. Jonah took a deliberate step back, his face carefully neutral. Ayanda's eyes darted to the prints, his heart pounding. He knew they matched his own. A villager whispered loudly, "Could it be witchcraft? Someone jealous of Sabelo's fortune?" Elder Naika raised a hand to quiet the crowd. "Be careful with your words. Witchcraft is not something we accuse lightly. But," he looked directly at Sabelo, "you must seek guidance. The spirits do not remain silent in times like these. They may reveal the truth." Sabelo nodded grimly, his jaw tightening. He turned to the crowd, his voice filled with resolve. "Then we will consult the Sangoma. If someone here has betrayed this family, the ancestors will not let them rest. I will not stop until I find out who has done this." The crowd murmured again. Some nodded in agreement, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Ayanda's breathing quickened. Jonah placed a firm hand on his shoulder, squeezing just enough to silence any outburst. Jonah leaned close, whispering to Ayanda, "Stay calm. No one knows. This will pass." Ayanda swallowed hard, unable to shake the image of the ash scattering in the wind the night before. The Sangoma's warning echoed in his mind. The curse always returns tenfold. He looked at the dead cows, then at Sabelo's resolute face, and felt the weight of his actions crushing him. In the quiet of the village, secrets and lies are like seeds sown in fertile soil. They grow in silence, but their fruits are bitter, their shadows long. Ayanda knew this well, but by the time the sun rose, it was already too late. The villagers dispersed slowly, their hushed conversations filling the morning air. Ayanda stood frozen, caught between Jonah's cold assurance and the creeping guilt that threatened to consume him. Deep into the night, the village was cloaked in an eerie silence. The soft chirp of crickets and the occasional distant call of a nightbird were the only sounds piercing the stillness. Ayanda lay restless on his woven mat inside his small, dimly lit hut. A single oil lamp flickered faintly in the corner, casting dancing shadows on the mud walls. His mind was haunted by the events of the day. Sabelo's fury, the dead cows, the elders' ominous words, and Jonah's cold, calculating whispers. Ayanda turned over, his brow slick with sweat despite the cool night air. Suddenly, he jerked awake, his eyes wide and his heart pounding. A sound, a faint, melodic whisper, drifted through the still air just outside his window. "What is that?" he whispered to himself, his voice trembling. He sat up slowly, his body tense and every nerve on edge. The whispers were soft, almost hypnotic, but deeply unsettling. They seemed to swirl around the hut, weaving in and out of the silence. He strained to make out the words, but they remained elusive, like the voice of the wind. Ayanda crawled closer to the window, his hands trembling as he lifted the thin reed mat that covered it. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, though the words were still incomprehensible. "Jonah, is that you? Stop playing games!" he called out, his voice shaking. There was no response. The whispers only grew more intense, carried on an unseen wind. A faint rustling sound followed, as though something or someone was moving just beyond the hut. Ayanda let the mat drop, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced toward the door. It was securely latched, but that did little to comfort him. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The abrupt silence was deafening, pressing down on him like a heavy weight. Ayanda froze, straining his ears, his eyes darting around the room. Then, a low, guttural growl echoed from the direction of the kraal. It was faint, but unmistakably unnatural, neither human nor animal. Ayanda's stomach churned. "What have I done?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. He clutched his knees to his chest, his mind racing. He considered waking Jonah, but was too afraid to move. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of scratching against the walls of the hut. Ayanda's entire body stiffened. He looked toward the oil lamp, its weak flame flickering violently, as though reacting to an unseen presence. Outside, the moon cast long shadows over the compound. The kraal sat eerily still, but the scratching sound continued. A shape moved briefly across the window, dark and formless, before vanishing. Ayanda's breath caught in his throat, his voice trembling as he muttered, almost praying, "Spirits, ancestors, forgive me. I didn't mean for this to happen." He reached for the small wooden charm hanging near his bed, a talisman gifted by his late grandmother. His fingers trembled as he gripped it tightly, murmuring a prayer under his breath. The scratching stopped, replaced by an ominous silence. Suddenly, a loud bang shook the wall of the hut, making Ayanda jump. His breath came in gasps as he stared at the door, half expecting it to burst open. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, circling the hut like a predator closing in on its prey. Ayanda scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with terror. From a distance, Jonah's voice rang out, shouting from his hut, "Ayanda! Ayanda! Are you hearing this?" Ayanda hesitated, his voice catching in his throat before he shouted back, "Yes, Jonah! What's happening?" At Jonah's hut, he stood in the doorway holding a makeshift club, a thick branch stripped of its bark. He stepped cautiously outside, his expression hard, but his movements betraying his fear. He looked toward Ayanda's hut and said urgently, "Stay inside. Don't open the door unless it's me." As Jonah surveyed the compound, his torchlight flickered over the kraal. For a brief moment, a dark figure appeared within the shadows of the cattle pens, a hunched form with glowing eyes. Jonah's torch sputtered, and when the light steadied, the figure was gone. Jonah's jaw tightened as he muttered to himself, "It's starting. The Sangoma warned us." Inside his hut, Ayanda collapsed to his knees, clutching the charm to his chest. The whispers faded into the night, leaving only the sound of his ragged breathing and the faint crackle of Jonah's torch outside. In the dead of night, guilt takes form, and shadows reveal the truth we try to bury. For Ayanda, the weight of his choices had awakened something old, something that would not be ignored. Ayanda's fearful eyes darted to the window, the darkness beyond growing deeper. The morning light filtered through the gaps in Ayanda's hut, casting golden rays on the mud walls. The quiet hum of the village waking up contrasted sharply with the turmoil inside. Ayanda lay sprawled on his mat, his body drenched in sweat. His chest heaved as though struggling for air, and his hands trembled uncontrollably. His once vibrant eyes were now sunken and glassy, darting around the room as if seeing something no one else could. Jonah stood near the doorway, his face a mask of confusion and thinly veiled fear. Clutching the frame of the door, his knuckles turned white as he watched Ayanda writhe on the mat. The usually composed brother now looked utterly afraid. Jonah spoke, his voice uncertain. "Ayanda, what's wrong with you? Is it a fever or something else?" Ayanda tried to speak, but his voice was a weak rasp. His body jerked involuntarily, as though some unseen force was pulling him in different directions. Trembling, he reached a hand toward Jonah, his cracked lips barely forming words. He whispered hoarsely, "Jonah, it's them! They're here!" Jonah stepped back, his eyes narrowing. His fear began to mingle with frustration as he struggled to make sense of Ayanda's words. Jonah's tone sharpened, almost desperate. "What are you talking about? Who's here? Stop speaking in riddles!" Ayanda groaned, turning his head toward the window, his eyes wide with terror. His body convulsed again as he whispered something Jonah could barely catch. "The whispers! They followed me! I shouldn't have done it! The kraal! The pot!" Jonah froze, his mind racing. He crouched next to Ayanda, gripping his brother's shoulders tightly. Jonah hissed, his voice low and urgent. "What do you mean? What did you do? Did you break the rules?" Ayanda nodded weakly, tears streaming down his face as his body continued to shiver violently. Jonah let go, stumbling backward, his expression darkening. The implications of Ayanda's confession sent a chill down his spine. Jonah whispered to himself, panic creeping into his voice. "You fool! You didn't—" The door creaked open slightly and an older woman peeked inside. It was Gogo Sibitsa, a respected elder and healer in the village. Her face was stern but calm, her eyes taking in the scene with a knowing look. She carried a small leather pouch slung over her shoulder and a carved wooden staff in her hand. Gogo Sibitsa spoke, her voice firm. "What is happening here? Why is the young one burning like this?" Jonah stammered, trying to explain but faltering under her piercing gaze. I don't know. He just woke up like this. Fever, shaking. He's been talking nonsense." Gogo Sibisa stepped further into the hut, her presence commanding. She knelt beside Ayanda, placing a cool hand on his forehead. Her lips moved in silent prayer as she studied him. Ayanda's trembling subsided slightly under her touch, but his breathing remained labored. She murmured softly, as if to herself, "This is no ordinary illness. His spirit is in turmoil. Something dark is at play." Jonah's jaw tightened, his fear now laced with guilt. Gogo Sibisa glanced over her shoulder at him, her voice sharp and direct. "Tell me, Jonah, what has this boy been up to? Spirits don't torment the innocent without cause." Jonah hesitated, his hands clenching into fists. He opened his mouth to speak, but closed it again, his mind racing for an excuse. Ayanda, still shaking, managed to croak a few words. The pot! Jonah said it would help. But the whispers, they followed me." Gogo Sibisa's eyes widened slightly as she turned fully to Jonah, her expression unreadable. She spoke coldly. "The pot! What pot, Jonah? What have you two meddled with?" Jonah avoided her gaze, his voice defensive but unconvincing. It was nothing. Just a small charm. Nothing dangerous." Her voice rose, laced with anger. "Nothing dangerous? You fool! You brought a curse into this family. The ancestors do not forgive such arrogance lightly." Ayanda groaned again, clutching at his chest as if trying to claw something out. Gogo Sibiza quickly opened her pouch, pulling out a handful of herbs and a small clay bowl. She mixed the herbs with water from a gourd, muttering incantations under her breath. She addressed Jonah without looking up. "If you value your brother's life, you will tell me everything. Now." Jonah hesitated for a long moment, his face a mixture of fear, guilt, and defiance. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was just supposed to make Sabelo weaker, so he'd share the inheritance. I didn't think it would go this far." Gogo Sibisa's hands froze, mid-motion. She looked up at Jonah, her eyes blazing with fury and disappointment. "You played with forces you don't understand. Now you've brought death to your door, and it will not leave easily." Ayanda's shivering form lay on the mat with Gogo Sibisa's determined efforts and Jonah's haunted expression. Outside, the sound of distant drumming began, signaling an approaching storm, or perhaps something far worse. When greed opens the door to the unknown, it invites consequences beyond imagining. Jonah and Ayanda had only begun to taste the bitterness of their choices, and the spirits were not done with them yet. The rising sun cast long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally, as though alive with an unseen force. The forest loomed dark and foreboding as Jonah stumbled through the dense undergrowth, his shirt torn and streaked with dirt. The towering trees seemed to lean closer with every step, their twisted branches forming funny shapes in the pale moonlight. The air was heavy, suffocating, and alive with the faint rustling of unseen creatures. Jonah's breathing was ragged, his movements agitated, his face a mask of desperation and anguish. He stopped abruptly in a small clearing, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. The moonlight bathed the clearing in an eerie silver glow, but the shadows surrounding it remained impenetrable, almost alive. Jonah looked up at the sky, his eyes wild and glistening with tears. Jonah shouted, his voice cracking, "Is this what you wanted, huh? Are you happy now?" His voice echoed through the trees, but the forest offered no response. Only the whisper of the wind answered, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and decay. Jonah clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as his voice grew louder, more frantic. "I did it for us, for my family. You know that. I didn't mean for things to get this bad." His voice broke, and he collapsed to his knees, his head bowed. Jonah slammed his fists into the ground, sending a small cloud of dust into the air. He muttered, his voice trembling, "It wasn't supposed to end like this. Sabelo was supposed to lose, not Ayanda, not like this." The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in a way that sounded almost like laughter, a cruel, mocking sound that sent a shiver down Jonah's spine. He froze, his eyes darting around the clearing. Jonah whispered, his voice barely audible, "Who's there? Show yourself!" A faint whisper echoed through the forest, indistinct and haunting. Jonah scrambled to his feet, spinning around to face the direction of the sound. He screamed, "Enough! Stop playing games! What do you want from me?" He picked up a nearby branch, wielding it like a weapon, though his trembling hands betrayed his fear. The whispers grew louder, circling the clearing, an unintelligible disharmony that seemed to seep into Jonah's very bones. He dropped the branch, clutching his head as if trying to block out the sound. Jonah pleaded, "Please, I'll do anything, just leave me alone." The whispers stopped suddenly, plunging the forest into an oppressive silence. Jonah looked around, his breath hitching, his eyes wide with terror. Then a deep voice emerged from the darkness, sending a chill down his spine. The voice was low, resonant, and chilling. "You opened the door, Jonah. Now you must pay the price." Jonah stumbled backward, his legs giving way beneath him. He stared into the shadows, his lips moving soundlessly as tears streamed down his face. "The blood you spilled cannot be undone. The spirits demand justice." The wind picked up again, swirling around Jonah in a frenzy. Leaves and dust rose into the air as he tried to shield himself from the chaos. The shadows seemed to close in, their forms becoming more defined. Long, twisted figures with glowing eyes that stared unblinkingly at him. Jonah sobbed, "I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't mean—" The wind died down as abruptly as it started, leaving the forest eerily still. Jonah was left on his knees, his head bowed, his body shaking. The voice faded into a whisper, its final words lingering ominously in the air. "The debt must be paid." The whispers faded into the distance, leaving only the faint rustle of leaves and Jonah's broken sobs. You see, when greed blinds the heart, the cost is often greater than one can bear. Jonah's choices had unleashed forces far beyond his understanding, forces that would not rest until balance was restored. Sabelo stood motionless in the middle of the homestead, the morning sun casting long shadows across the ground. The once bustling yard was eerily silent, save for the occasional chirping of birds in the distance. The huts around him, weathered by time, seemed like silent witnesses to the tragedy that had unfolded here. The emptiness of the place pressed down on him, a suffocating reminder of the family he had lost and the price of their collective greed. Sabelo's face had an expression, a mixture of sorrow, exhaustion, and quiet resignation. His shoulders sagged under the weight of everything he had endured. In his hand he clutched a small carved wooden icon, a keepsake left behind by their late father. He rubbed his thumb over its smooth surface, as though seeking comfort or answers from the past. He murmured to himself, "This land, it was supposed to unite us. Baba wanted us to grow together, to build something lasting. But look at what we've done." His gaze shifted toward the kraal, now empty save for a few scrawny goats. The once thriving herd had been decimated, first by mysterious deaths, then by the chaos that tore the family apart. The broken pieces of the clay pot Ayanda once carried lay scattered in the dirt, a haunting reminder of the events that led to this moment. Sabelo stepped forward slowly, his footsteps stirring up small clouds of dust. His eyes moved to the path leading out of the homestead, the one Jonah had taken on the night he disappeared into the forest, never to return. A flicker of anger crossed his face, but quickly faded into sadness. He spoke to the empty yard, his voice heavy. "You wanted everything, Jonah, and in the end you lost it all. Was it worth it?" He turned to face the hut, where Ayanda once lived. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. Sabelo's eyes lingered there, filled with regret. "And you, Ayanda," he said, his voice tinged with sorrow. "You followed him down that dark path. You let his whispers lead you to ruin. If only you had trusted me. If only we had trusted each other." The wind picked up slightly, rustling the dry grass around the yard. Sabelo shivered, pulling his worn cloak tighter around his shoulders. He looked up at the sky, his eyes scanning the clouds as if searching for a sign of forgiveness, of guidance, of anything to help him make sense of what remained. The land is quiet now, but it remembers. It remembers the laughter of a family united, the anger that tore them apart, and the blood spilled in the name of greed. Sabelo remains, the last keeper of their father's dream, left to carry the burden of rebuilding what was lost. Sabelo turned back toward the main hut, his movements slow and deliberate. He paused at the doorway, his hand resting on the frame. The totem dangled from his other hand, swaying gently. He took a deep breath before stepping inside, disappearing into the shadows. A faint breeze stirred the dust, in an empty yard, carrying with it the faint echoes of past laughter and whispered regrets. Greed may tear apart what love has built, but even in the ashes, a seed of hope can grow, if those left behind choose to nurture it. Sabelo's story is a reminder that peace is a choice, but it comes at a cost. And so, the land remains, silent, watching and waiting. It holds the memories of those who came before, of their joys, their sorrows, and their failures. If there is one thing to learn from this tale, it is this: greed may win battles, but it will never win peace. Only love and understanding can heal what jealousy and pride destroy. This world, my friends, holds many stories, some of them hidden deep in the roots of the land, waiting to be unearthed. This is just one. There are many more, just as mysterious, just as haunting. If you want to hear them, to walk with me through the shadows of these tales and uncover their lessons, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next story. And share this tale with someone who needs to remember the dangers of greed. Listen closely. The night has secrets of its own. Until next time.